February the 24th, 2022, Russia launches a massive coordinated invasion into Ukraine. Cities across the country are shelled, and tense fighting erupts from Kiev to Kherson. Yet, despite the full-scale assault, a mix of Russian military failures and Ukrainian resistance prevents Russia from seizing Kiev. NATO responds, flooding Ukraine with weapons and support. Russian forces withdraw from Kiev and focus on the south and Donbass, leading to years of brutal warfare. Millions are displaced, with casualties mounting. New fronts open around Kursk and Kharkiv. The war has been devastating. After Ukraine's failure to cut off Russia's land bridge through Zaporizhia, Russian forces launch relentless attacks into Donetsk. Ukraine is pushed back from its 2014 fortifications, and Russia threatens to take the entire oblast. Now, with manpower shortages and attritional warfare draining Ukraine, Russia edges closer to victory. But Ukraine's independence seems secured, and the government will likely persist in some form despite the peace deal. The American election, just days away as I write this, could shape the outcome, potentially even pushing towards negotiated peace that would leave neither side satisfied. But this begs the question, what if Russia's initial 2022 offensive had succeeded? Imagine a world where Kiev fell in those initial weeks and Ukraine capitulated. What if Russia won? So how can Russia's initial invasion succeed? I see two main things that need to change. Russia needs to be better prepared for the invasion, while Ukraine needs to be less prepared. Russia quietly begins to reform the military. They focus on improving logistical capabilities and enforcing maintenance standards. This is able to curb some of the systemic corruption that led to equipment breakdowns and logistical failures in our own timeline. These reforms would be quiet, with the goal of going unnoticed by American spies. They would drastically improve Russian combat capabilities and allow them to push much deeper into Ukraine without running into logistical problems. Russia reclassifies conscripts under new legal terms, allowing them to defend Russian interests abroad in defensive and logistical roles, freeing up more Russian regulars. The Russian government would also increase signing bonuses for its regular forces, expanding their assault force. In our own timeline, Russia invaded Ukraine with 180,000 soldiers, only 80,000 of which being combat troops. Meanwhile, Ukraine, on the other hand, counting reserves, had 1 million soldiers at their disposal. For Russia to win, they need to bring as much soldiers as possible. Russia would begin to drill on the Ukrainian border as much as possible to prepare conscripts for war under the guise of standard drills, similar to our own timeline, but on a much larger scale, possibly alerting America and Ukraine earlier. Similar to our own timeline, Russia launches a propaganda campaign around protecting Russian minorities in the Donbass and curbing NATO expansion, only much earlier this time in order to prime the Russian population for war. Russia spreads images of the Azov Battalion and other far-right paramilitary groups in Ukraine, exaggerating the Nazi presence in the Ukrainian military. This could cause increased scrutiny from the international community and could even lead to Ukraine cracking down on these groups and weakening their army. In this scenario, Ukraine's defenses are weakened by a combination of increased corruption, poor leadership, and less NATO support following the annexation of Crimea. NATO is much less confrontational with the Russians in this timeline, focusing more on China and other geopolitical threats, leading to a weakened Ukrainian military completely unprepared for the Russian invasion. Without NATO support, like the Javelins and NLAWs, which were pivotal in our own timeline to slow the Russian advance, aren't present in Ukraine, or at the very least there's much less of them. In our own timeline, British and other NATO instructors trained Ukrainian units in the years leading up to 2022. In this timeline, this never happens, with more resources going to the Middle East or some other field. Similar to our own timeline, Russia begins a bombing and artillery campaign throughout Ukraine against military and symbolic targets, softening up their defenses. As the invasion begins, Zelensky is assassinated, which was attempted in our own timeline. This throws the Ukrainian government into disarray. The propaganda value of Zelensky and his acting skills is hard to replace, and there isn't a leader for the people to rally around. Russian forces are much more numerous and well prepared in this timeline, allowing them to occupy major cities like Sumy, which they occupied in our own timeline with little resistance but abandoned to send more troops to Kiev. With improved logistics, Russia is able to move faster and deeper into the country without large convoys and logistical bottlenecks like we saw in our own timeline. In the east, Russian troops are able to encircle the Donbass, trapping a large portion of Ukraine's most battle-hardened soldiers, effectively splitting the Ukrainian army in two. Major urban centers like Kharkiv are encircled, and Russian forces further crippling Ukrainian logistics. In the south, Russian forces are able to attack from Crimea, pushing through Kherson with little resistance, and then capturing Mykolaiv. They begin advancing towards Odessa, encountering minimal resistance. Mariupol is encircled like in our own timeline, trapping elite Ukrainian units, including the Azov Brigade. Kiev is encircled by Russian forces and fighting breaks out on the inside of the city. The civilian government is replaced by a military government and martial law is declared across the country, which is extremely unpopular. Russian forces begin an assault on Zaporizhia, and the Ukrainian army in the east begins to break down, with mass surrenders and mutinies. Ukrainian logistics break down, and Russia fans out across the country, taking many towns and cities with minimal resistance. Russian forces encircle Odessa, linking up with their forces in Transnistria, using the vast Russian stockpiles in the breakaway state to reinforce their logistics in the region. Ukraine has very few forces in the region, so the south largely falls to Russian control, with only a few holdouts in the major urban centers holding out, cut off from the rest of the army. Russian assaults begin to pierce through the Ukrainian lines in Kiev, and the encircled forces dissolve into chaos as communications break down and many generals and politicians are captured. Seeing that the situation is hopeless, what is left of the Ukrainian government surrenders, and most of the military stands down with the more ideological militias such as Azov Battalion and Kraken Brigade refusing to surrender and fighting to the last man. Many Ukrainian soldiers form guerrilla cells and continue the fight in a reduced capacity, although with the country being mostly open fields, their movements are doomed to failure in the long term. After Odessa surrenders, Russian troops begin to enter Moldova, launching the second invasion of the SMO under the justification of protecting Transnistria's independence. Rosvadia units flood into Ukraine and begin arresting politicians and pro-Western dissidents, asserting Russian control over the country. In the peace treaty, the Donbass republics are given nominal independence, and a pro-Russian regime is placed in Kiev, making the country a de facto Russian puppet state. Transnistria and Moldova are folded into a Russian puppet state, and Russification campaigns begin in all of the new states, primarily in eastern Ukraine. It's possible that regions of Ukraine are offered to Poland and Hungary to legitimize their own conquests, but it's unlikely they would accept due to NATO pressure. What's left of Ukraine's government flees to America, where a government in exile is set up. This government holds very little legitimacy without a clear leader and is mainly composed of generals and corrupt politicians. The European countries are horrified by this show of Russian strength. Sanctions are slapped on Russia, but like in our own timeline, only have short-term drawbacks for the Russian economy and in the long run prove ineffective as European countries begin to suffer due to lack of Russian gas. Without an ongoing war, it's possible that the sanctions are slightly more lenient than in our own timeline, but Russia is still likely cut off from the European and North American economies. America begins to funnel weapons to Ukrainian guerrillas, but beyond that, their response is weak. The invasion sends a signal to the world that force is once again a viable means of gaining geopolitical power. Countries like China and Iran ramp up their own military operations as the world becomes increasingly unstable. Biden's administration faces increased criticism over the loss of Ukraine and is largely blamed, as this happens shortly after the botched withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Biden's foreign policy was already under increased scrutiny. As China ramps up military buildup around Taiwan, the average American's trust in Biden's ability to protect its interests significantly erodes. Republicans capitalize on this as painting Biden as a weak and ineffective leader. This significantly increases Trump's chance of election. The U.S. The US faces increased pressure from Eastern European countries to increase American presence on the new Russian border. Biden is cornered, with the American public being wary of foreign entanglements further dividing the American people. Domestic sentiment shifts towards isolationism. Trump and other Republicans increasingly campaign on isolationist and domestic security. This causes Republican resurgence, making it increasingly likely for Biden and later Kamala Harris to lose the presidency in 2024. After some time, Russia integrates Belarus, Ukraine, the Donbass, and Moldova into a union state, now forming a Russian empire right on NATO's border. This massive new bloc represents Russian resurgence as a superpower and sends a terrifying message to Eastern Europe. Around this time, Finland and Sweden are officially admitted into NATO, straining the Russian military with a new and enlarged front line, with NATO being hard to maintain. The border is tense but stable, as the threat of mutually assured destruction stops either side from taking direct action against the other. The new border remains heavily militarized, with Russian and NATO forces regularly conducting drills and keeping the states of Eastern Europe in constant fear of war. Russian influence over Europe is expanded, and a new potential for proxy conflicts in Kosovo and Bosnia is there, with Serbia expanding its ties with Russia. Hungary would be less loyal to NATO, maintaining friendly relations with Russia and possibly being granted the Zakarpattia Oblast in exchange for them defecting to the CTSO, although this is unlikely unless the US goes full isolationists, as this would leave Hungary surrounded on nearly all sides. Europe will likely militarize in the coming years, potentially cutting social programs to fund the build-up, especially if the Americans go isolationist following the elections. This could lead to the debate around the European army re-entering the spotlight, as many smaller countries such as the Baltics will be incapable of defending themselves. With its forces freed up, Russia exerts increased pressure onto Georgia and makes efforts to keep Armenia from drifting into the American sphere. It's possible that Azerbaijan is stopped from finishing their invasion of Nagorno-Karabakh. It's even possible that if NATO isn't active enough, an invasion of Georgia would commence, folding the country and its pro-Russian breakaway republics into the Union state. Russia increases its influence over Kazakhstan and other former Central Asian territories. These are likely to eventually be tied into the Union state in the coming years, but a series of revolutions and low-intensity wars in Central Asia are likely to be fought as populations make attempt to break away from Russian influence. Overall, the region for the most part remains under Russian influence, with some slight Chinese influence maintained. The president of the Union State, Putin, is deified in Russian history as the man who dragged Russia out of the chaos of the collapse of the Soviet Union and restored Russian power. Statues were erected across the empire, and after his eventual death, he goes down in history as a Russian hero, similar to the amount of fame that Lenin or Peter the Great enjoy. He continues to tighten his grip on power and strengthen his alliances, such as BRICS, which, like in our own timeline, is expanded to include nations like Iran. The events of October 7th still likely occur as Hamas attacks Israel, leading to a new war in the Middle East. The main difference is that Iran is significantly empowered to strike Israel directly with Russian backing. The events would go more or less the same, with Israel occupying Gaza and eventually invading Lebanon. This conflict is still ongoing today, so it's hard to make predictions, but I'd assume it would be largely similar, with Iran being more confrontational. Significant escalation is unlikely, though. It's possible that Biden might take a stronger pro-Israel stance to make up for the previous geopolitical failures, but this would likely divide his largely pro-Palestinian base and piss off the isolationists, so I doubt much would change. I don't see China launching an invasion of Taiwan any earlier than they plan to do in our own timeline, but let's say hypothetically they launch an invasion soon after the Russian conquest. There are two possible timelines. China launches a surprise attack and levels Taiwan with missile strikes and long-range artillery. China deploys millions of troops to take the island. The American Navy does not intervene to defend the island, not wanting to start a world war. The major cities fall and the war continues in the mountains for some time, while the rest of the country is pacified. Sanctions are levied against China, and Taiwan is reintegrated into the PRC, making China's own ascension to superpower status known, with U.S. bases across the Pacific under threat, and many nations lose faith in the U.S.'s ability to protect them. This conflict has a higher likelihood of U.S. intervention due to the microchip production being pivotal to the U.S. economy. American ships engaged the Chinese Navy in the Taiwan Strait, leading to a costly naval battle. China launches missiles at American bases across the Pacific, and the conflict escalates into a regional war, with Japan and Australia getting involved on Taiwan's behalf. China has a hard time resupplying their forces in the island due to the ocean being contested. Because of this, they fail to accomplish their strategic objectives, as America breaks the blockade and lands its own troops on the island. The fighting is brutal, but China is eventually driven out, losing hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the process. Russia and other nations step in to mediate a peace treaty. President Xi is deposed in the aftermath, and China's power projection is severely damaged, with the possibility of the whole country collapsing. No matter who wins, there would be several significant repercussions to this war. The first major repercussion would be a global microchip shortage, which would severely damage the U.S. economy, which, assuming this happens during Biden's presidency, would be his latest disaster on a growing list of foreign policy failures. The Chinese economy would be heavily sanctioned, which would make China more dependent on Russia and other sanctioned nations for food and fossil fuel imports. The Chinese economy would shrink without being able to export goods to the West. In the scenario where China loses the war, this would likely lead to mass unrest and the fall of the Chinese Communist Party. These sanctions would significantly hurt America in the short term, as domestic industry is forced to return home. In the long term, however, this would likely empower the middle class and secure more jobs, giving America more power economically, although this would take decades, damaging Biden's presidency further. Russia would gain significant influence over China and be able to grow its own economy through exporting to China on a larger scale. Overall, the world would be a significantly different place if Ukraine couldn't hold off Russia's initial invasion. The world would be much more multipolar, which is a process that is slowly happening in our real world. There would be a strong Russian empire in the 21st century, and America would either play a more significant role in Europe, beginning a new Cold War, or falling into isolationism, creating a much more chaotic multipolar world. Things wouldn't be perfect for Russia, however, as declining birth rates and unrest in its newly conquered territories would remain an issue for decades to come. How Russia handles these problems, as well as what happens after Putin's death, will largely determine Russia's future, and will be the difference between them achieving superpower status or falling into decline and eventually collapsing. It's hard to say if Ukraine would be better off in this scenario, as on one hand they would lose their independence and be a subject to Russification policies, but on the other hand, millions of Ukrainians wouldn't flee the country, and potentially millions wouldn't be killed in the prolonged war. Thanks for watching. If you found this scenario interesting, please like and subscribe. If you have any criticism or want to expand on anything, please let me know in the comments. Until then, have a great day.